It's kind of interesting. People a lot of times come to me and they say, I'm looking for a new amp. What should I buy? And my response is generally, I'm getting kind of hungry. What should I have for lunch? It's all a personal preference. And this year on the panel,
How you doing, man?
I tried to pick people that Tone Wizards panel. Basically, I'm going to start off by saying the same thing that I've said for the last 10 panels, this being the 11th. I basically am not a fan of formalized education. I used to hate school. I used to hate being lectured to. So I didn't come up with any kind of agenda here that I'm going to speak to you about. This is going to be a panel for you guys where you can ask your questions to these folks. I'm going to stop in a moment and let each of these people introduce themselves, tell you where, they'll take about a minute, 90 seconds to tell you a bit about who they are, what they do, so you know what they are. But for example, I'm glad that these two guys are sitting so close to each other because it shows some of the diversity on the panel. They do completely different opposite ends of the scale amplifier things, and then Todd has his own twist on things. And I'm not even going to get into Mike. He's worked for SAE, or Rivera, Bad Cats. I can't even list the companies. Maybe you can go over some of them later. Yeah, well, yeah, 65 amps, whatever. Anyway, I'm going to turn this over, and Eric, go for it.
Hi, how you doing? My name is Eric Carpenter. I own Carp Amplification. Everybody calls me Carp. It's from being like 9 years old and longer. I'm a fly fisherman. It's a stinky, smelly fish, I know. So just call me Carp when you see me around and say hi. My amplifiers are based on the old Fenders, basically the AB763 model, single channel. Went for a nice, real clean, chimey type tone to them. Yeah, and way different from, the Days amps. Maybe one day I'll be up there, but I like that style. It's what my ear wants to hear. No matter what you do, you kind of end up building what your ear likes, and you end up turning that into that. Whatever you start out with, it ends up being that way. So that's what I like. That's what I build. I'm out of Norco, California, which is northern Corona, kind of out past Anaheim, about an hour and a half from here, and kind of go to the armpit of California and hang left, and that's where I'm at. I'm a real small guy. I build amps one at a time from ground up. I do a lot of repair. I like restoring the old stuff, the old tube amp stuff. I stay with that kind of thing. I've got a lot of old Fenders coming through the shop, some real old, some of the old Supros and that kind of stuff. I kind of like that hand-wired, point-to-point, bringing that stuff back to life, and that's kind of where I'm from and where I approach this.
That was a lot of talking. I don't have nearly that much to say. Dave Friedman. I make Friedman amps. You might be familiar with them, maybe not, but probably by now. High gain, more Marshally sort of amps. Mostly hand-wired. We're venturing into some other things down the road, and we're branching out a lot, actually. Do some guitars, do some pedals coming up in the future, and we're based in North Hollywood here.
I'd mention some of your switching devices, Dave Friedman rack systems.
Yeah, I mean, I've been also doing rigs for touring guitar players for a million years now, back since the early 90s. And also we'll be venturing into some products revolving around that, pedal boards and different products also coming in the next year here. So, doing what I know.
Hey everybody, I'm Todd Sharp. I have Todd Sharp Amplifiers. We're just launching a company, ToddSharpAmps.com. And I'll tell you again, some of the guys were here. I'm a guitar player, really. I just celebrated a 40-year anniversary when I joined my first well-known band. I played with Hall & Oates from 75 to about 78. Worked with Rod Stewart for a bunch of years playing guitar, Delbert McClinton, Carlene Carter, Mick Fleetwood, Christine McVie. lots of other people. I lived here for a long time. When I was a young lad, 7 years old, I really got my first start in electronics. You know, like many people, I got a ham radio license. I built a power supply and a transmitter. I kind of got hooked. I got into music a few years later and left that whole electronics thing until about 20-some years ago. I'm obviously a guitar freak, and I've always been an amp freak. Like I was saying before, I think I got back into it when I got my first AC-30 about 30 years ago. The damn thing blew up every third time I turned it on, so I got into fixing amps again. I moved to Nashville about 20-some years ago and eventually opened a shop. And I work on gear for pretty much all the guys in Nashville, and a lot of people have been doing that for a long time. So I sort of have this dual perspective as a player and also as an electronics guy and an amp guy. And now I'm building Todd Sharp amplifiers. We're in room 2012. And it's really not an amp that's based on something. I kind of figure, by the way, it's great to be here and with these guys who are terrific guys and guys that I've talked to sometimes and respect.
Sometimes.
Yeah, and so I figure there's already enough people doing designs based on sort of existing designs, and they're doing it really well. So I just kind of figure we don't need another Tweed Deluxe knockoff out there. So my amps are really a different approach in a lot of ways, and be sure to stop up to the room while you're here. Also, I'm playing tonight. My band is playing at the Baked Potato at 9 o'clock. And, if you're especially nice to me, maybe I can get you on the guest list because I know people. Thanks.
I'm Mike, working at Bad Cat. I've worked 7 or 8 different amp companies, Rivera, Bogner, Dietzel USA, 65 amps for years, did all the engineering for all those amps. Now I'm at Bad Cat, and I have a repair shop in North Hollywood. So I work kind of half and half. Half the time at Bad Cat and half the time doing my own repairs, which pays better, actually. That's it.
So I'm going to open this up. Oops, I have to remember to stay on the microphone or the camera person will be really, really upset with me. Anyway, I'm going to open this up. Anybody have a question about it? You guys know how this works. Somebody have a question about something that you want to address to one of these guys?
If you have like an island board circuit, like some offenders or something, and you change it sort of the solder codes, like higher circuit, would it change anything technically, or would it just
Should we repeat that for the microphone for the tape?
Do we have a wireless mic here, somebody? You know what? Come on up here for a minute. This way you can also be on camera. This is like, this might be your 15 minutes of fame.
If an eyelet, like,
Face the camera.
if a fender circuit was built, on an eyelet board, if you built it using solder cups instead of the eyelet board, but it was all the components, the circuit was the same, but it was just built with solder cups, would it have any impact on the sound?
What are solder cups?
Or, like the post.
Turret?
Turret.
Would it sound the same?
I would say it
Maybe.
would sound the same, probably. I mean, I
Very
don't think it
close.
would have that much difference, really.
I concur. No real difference.
The difference would come into play on the wiring changes that you made and possibly the mistakes or whatever that you made more than anything else. Just,
Yeah, the Fender amps, they don't push very hard, so you can do pretty radical changes. I mean, wiring and like you're saying, the soldering, it's not going to change. It's when you get into the high gain things that those little nuances poke out and the frequencies poke out of the speakers. So you have to be careful, more careful with those kind of high gain circuits. But I don't think Fenders are pretty forgiving. You can do a lot of stupid shit and it'll still sound pretty good.
I resemble that.
I'll just mention real quick for some people that follow the state of tubes and tube production that things aren't getting any better since we've started looking at this 20 some odd years ago. Any other questions? Come on up. You have to. Okay, the question is he's looking at purchasing his first Class A amp, meaning you're talking a cathode biased amp, not something like an AC30 that really is a cathode biased AB amp. Is he going to notice any kind of a difference? And I'll leave that up to you folks.
Good question. So maybe let's try and clear up a little confusion straight away. You know, Miles mentioned a cathode biased amp, which doesn't really mean it's a Class A amp, but they tend to be associated with Class A.
And also, is it
especially
single-ended?
in the older designs.
Single tube or? Okay.
And I think, you know, maybe Mike could talk to that a little bit. I would just say one thing, that there really aren't any Class A amplifiers that are truly Class A guitar amplifiers. Although people talk about it in that sense, there may be a couple that have slipped by me, but you know, Class A is sort of a misrepresented term a lot with guitar amps. It actually is a specific definition of how a tube is biased and operated. And in most of our guitar world, we tend to like, you know, a fair amount of power, and you know, we get close to them. Like, say for instance, the AC30 is a famously heralded, supposedly Class A amp. It's really very close to Class A, but it's not purely Class A. There is a difference in the way those amps sound. I think there is. They're a little more responsive to touch, and maybe they sound a little faster. And the reason is they're biased so hot that they're never, well, they're biased in a way in their characteristic curve, and this gets very technical, that they never reach cutoff. But they're always all the way on, is what they are. So they're sitting there actually wasting more power until you play them. Then they dissipate less power, and it's kind of a hard concept to get. But that produces a certain kind of sound. And anyhow, Mike probably knows a little bit more about current.
I just want to
Class
jump
A.
in here real quick, Mike, and just mention people that do have cathode biased amps, keep in mind that when you're playing the amp at low level or not playing it at all, if it's not in standby, the amp is running it flat out, which is one of the reasons that your tube wear is generally much faster on a cathode biased amp than a grid biased amp.
Yeah, like you said, Class A, like they were trying to the only amps that are true Class A are single-ended amps. You've got a single tube, and that's my understanding of it. But most things you're talking about, what Bad Cat makes, 65 makes, are cathode biased. And like Miles said, this is a tube that's always on. It draws more current when it's sitting there doing nothing, when it's not working. And that's why your cathode bias amp burns up tubes while it's just sitting there on the floor of the music store, because it's drawing the most current. But it's always on, whereas a Fender or a Marshall, it has a negative voltage that holds the tube in control, and it's shut off. And then it has this very sharp cutoff in a push-pull. If you imagine a sine wave, comes up, and then tube A just shuts off. Tube B turns on, and they're turning on and off like this, like at 1 million miles a second. And so those tubes last longer, and you get more power out of them. So if you're looking for power and clarity, then you get a grid biased amp. Cathode bias, you get about half the power out of the amp, but it sounds louder than shit because.
Plus a better smell.
But because it has a bigger dynamic range, the tube is always on, and you put a 30-watt AC30 up next to a Showman or something, they're just as loud. Just as loud to your ear. So it's kind of confusing, but they do sound different. They have a warmth. The cathode bias is a warm sound, and it's an organic sound. You know, a lot of people like it. I'm a Fender guy. I play Fenders, but I build cathode bias amps because, you know, that's what the people like you want. So.
One thing to keep at, one point I can make here is, for example, a twin reverb 6L6 amp. You can see those amps with thousands of hours on the output tubes. Yet EL84 amps, some of them, an example, Brad Paisley's amps, those output tube sets are changed every 10 shows, about every 30 hours, and a huge difference is noted. So you're looking at 30 hours versus thousands of hours, although the tube types are very different, and there's other factors there, but that's a generality as tube wear in a cathode biased amp.
Yeah, you're going to
It's gonna
change
be much
tubes more
higher.
often. You're going to notice like it's lost something, you know, in a cathode bias amp after you play it for, you know, half a year, and you're going to have to change the tubes because they're pushed to the max. Especially, I mean, bad cat. We just go way past spec. The spec is, you know, whatever the specs which was written 40 years ago, so it doesn't apply anyway. But you just push them to they should be melting, and so you're going to have to change tubes. You make a remarkable benefit when you do that, you know. But how long do you want to wait until you sound good, right? You want to sound good now, so who cares? Change some tubes, change a light bulb. You know, you can do that.
Mike, since you have the mic, why don't you pick the next contestant?
Okay.
Since you guys have been in the music business for a long time, and the gentleman in the middle played with Hall & Oates and done a lot of various things in the music industry, and most of us would like to pursue more in the music industry, what's your best piece of business advice?
I guess that's for me, I don't know.
No, I meant for all you guys.
Okay. Well, I guess I would say let's talk about clothing first and hair. So get your shit together. Okay? And then, you know, we'll talk about guitars and amps and whether you use a coil cord or a straight cord. That's a big one. So I don't know. I guess, you know, I've been real fortunate to have played with some great people over the years. I think if I really tried to answer that question honestly, and, you know, some of that actually kind of was honest, actually. But, you know, it takes a while sometimes to find your sound. And I'll say, you know, it's taken me a while to find my sound. I think I could play pretty good for a long time, but I definitely, you know, struggled through navigating, like, you know, I'm one of those guys who bought everything, right? I had, you know, all kinds of stuff, and so it got to where I'd do a session, and you know, somebody'd call me, and I'd go, and I'd call them back and go, well, what are we going to do? Because I don't know if I should bring the Marshall, or a Gretsch, or a Telecaster, or should I bring my Dumble, or a Princeton, or, you know, and then I just have a guy like, well, you know, I'd call up Andy Brower and go, bring it all. You know, it's a Bob Seger session. I don't know what he's going to want. And what I found out after a lot of years of doing all that is when I thought I was going to plug my Gretsch Chet Atkins into an AC30 and sound like George Harrison, it just always sounded just like me. And eventually I kind of went after all that stuff, and it's not crap, I was going to call it crap, but all this gear and, you know, a Bradshaw switching system and, you know, buttons that could take me to this amp to that amp if I'm going to play that. And you, certainly if you're on tour with Rod Stewart and you're somebody, you need to cover all kinds of sounds for songs that were, you know, on records. You need a lot of that stuff. But mostly, eventually, what I found is that I pretty much get the same sound out of no matter what I plug into. And the real deal is, what is it that lets me get that sound with the least amount of fight, you know? So I'm not up there going, damn it, I can't seem to get my tone tonight, you know? And it's always the same tone I'm going to get. So the question is, what is it that lets me do it best? And that's just I think, trial and error of figuring out eventually, like, yeah, that lets me, I'm not fighting this rig too much, you know?
Basically, that's, you know, just one story. And I think the bottom line is there's a million stories. People fall into things and become successful. Other people have a lot of talent and never become successful in the public eye. I don't know if that's a question one can really answer. I mean, I look at the two guys on the end here. They're both performers on a very regular basis. Yeah, Mike has all of his amp stuff and he's always busy, but he's in a couple of bands, tribute bands, a Creedence Clearwater band and a ZZ Top band, and they're booked for, you know, huge conventions and Las Vegas kind of stuff and all over the place. And he has the beard and the swirling guitar and all of that kind of stuff, and probably a very different gig and very different background than Todd has. I don't know if you can really answer that question about how does one get into the music business, or what, you know, what path can you take?
Yeah, it's at this point you just got to play for the love of it. You know, that's as simple as that. You got to play. I mean, I have a couple bands that I play with. The beauty is I can build amps specifically for those shows, for that act. I have somebody else pay for the parts, and I build it and I use it on the show. So, but it's just I just love playing. I just want to get up on the stage and play as much as I can. You know, that's all. I still have that thing when I was young. You know, so how to make it? If people knew how to make it or what you need to do, they wouldn't tell you.
They'd write a book.
They want to tell. So at this point, all I can suggest is do it because you love playing, and the sound that comes out of the amp when you're playing, that's what you do it for. That's what I do it for.
So obviously, I'm a big Friedman fanatic here, but this is probably a question for Dave, but probably everybody. I mean,
Your hair's kind of like
something like that, yeah. But we all have this thing called the tone in our head, right? And I think Friedman, from a high game perspective, really captures that, and it's amazing. Like, so Dave, what was that tone in your head, the reference tone that you used to kind of perfect the brown eye? Would be a question for you, but maybe that's a question for everybody. What was that reference tone that really made you stop and say, I want to build something like that, like the artist or the amp that you had in your head?
It's a cool question.
It's a good question. I mean, I'm trying to single out one. I don't think there's one exactly. You know, it was kind of a mixture of a bunch of people. I was always an English amp fan, Marshall, you know, Plexi amp fan. So when I was growing up, at least my era was you know, throughout the 80s when I was a teenager, and so that era would be, you know, like the hard rock kind of bands and Van Halen and things like that. And so probably, you know, there's a lot of players from that era that had a great tone for that Marshall-y sort of the vibe. So, you know, the Van Halens, and then I mean, there's a lot of them. But including going back further, like even like Jimmy Page and AC/DC and Angus Young, you know, and anything with kind of a strong, identifiable kind of Marshall tone, I would go after, you know. But probably the one thing, Van Halen, along with 10 million other people I know. But really, it's a Marshall. It's a Marshall with great players' hands, which ties into what you were saying. It really comes down to the player, because I've seen him play in a Line 6 amp, and it sounds like him. So, I have one in particular amp that I've had since maybe 1990. That's a 50-watt, 68 Plexi amplifier that I've used forever, and that is the basis of everything I've ever done. It all started there. How do you make an amp with a master volume, with gain and some control, also be able to sound like that dimed out old Marshall. So that's where it started. Everything else, I mean, I personally like a dimed out Marshall, that's enough gain for me. Anything else was just really for people, for other people that wanted more. I don't believe in that, actually. I think less is better. A lot less. Way less. But, you know, less gain equals bigger tone, punchier, cuts better, everything about it, really. So, I hope that answered it.
Thanks for being here, guys. Kind of piggybacks on that question, because I think one thing that a lot of you guys have had that I haven't, probably other people haven't had the opportunity to do, is play through a lot of different types of amps, the old AC30s, your Tweeds, the real deal, you know, and you know how those amps work, and you've used that to kind of inform how you build amps now. And I'm curious as a player, and you guys are all players obviously too, it's like, what do you look for in those particular amp types that make it what it is? Like for example, if I'm playing a Marshall and I want a crunchy sound, I'm looking for a lot of thump in the low mid, or if it's a Fender, I want a lot of punch out of the amp so I can do some real percussive stuff with it, or if it's a lead tone, maybe the sustain's gonna make me play a different way. Take that whatever direction you want to do, because I know it's a really broad subject, but I thought I'd like to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Well, these are good questions, and I think, you know, everybody's got their own take on it. So I think that for myself, you know, when I'm building an amp, when I'm chasing, if it's a sound I'm hearing or looking for, in comparison to what are those amps that are out there that have those signatures. And I think we all know there are certain ones that have signatures, and it's a really interesting thing when you look at this whole state of the art, right, of these tube guitar amplifiers, which is barely moved, really, you know, in a major way, you know, like vacuum tube push-pull AB, class AB amplifiers, sort of dug in the 40s with the Williamson negative feedback circuit. And that's kind of like what we all play through, with few exceptions. And then we've, you know, gotten into gain and channel switching and a few things to, you know, line 6, you know, which are kind of just amazing. They do everything modeled. So I think for me, man, a lot of this isn't about tone. It's almost like when I work on amps, it's like some amps, there's a sound in there somewhere. And I think I've always been more of a guy that I'm trying to find the sound that that amp does and give that back to a guy and go, you're going to like it better now. And a lot of amps nowadays are trying to be Swiss Army knife, so it's really like the amp's got 3 sounds or 4 sounds, which is great. I'm not saying it isn't. I just always figured I won the battle if I can get one good sound out of an amplifier. Then I'm like, great. I plug the Silvertone into that sucker, and it sounds amazing. And that's what it does. You know, a 59 Bassman does a certain thing, and a great Marshall does a certain thing. I think that a lot of this, you know, I use an example where, you know, what I'm after is a feel more than a tone. It's something that's happening between the fingerboard, my fingertips, and the speaker cones, and the baffle board. You know, this dynamic thing that when I play, it's feeling right. And sometimes if it's not right, it feels like, who put the 11s on my guitar?
Actually, Todd, let me kind of elaborate on that a little bit. It's not as much tone or something that's definable as much as it is emotional. I think of an example, or a number of examples, where Mike, myself, Dan Boole, and a couple people were all under the same roof. And every once in a while, we'd get this big 100-watt Marshall stack, full stack, or we'd have a couple of them, 2 of them, 3 of them, sometimes with somebody like George's amps or something like that. And the workday would end, and people would plug into those, and they would just go crazy. there's a lot of things about low wattage amps and this and that, but I'll tell you what, if you've never stood in front of something like a Marshall stack, just find one sometime, do it sometime, and just play a couple power chords. And it's hard to describe, but there's something really special that goes on there. And I don't know if that's definable, but it's touching on what you were just talking about.
You know, what Todd said, I've been involved in the design of a lot of different products. And, you know, you have a basic concept of what you're shooting for, and a lot of times you don't get there. But most of the things that happen for me are accidents. And you play it, and there's some kind of emotional response. You hear it, you just, something turns on. And you can't, I haven't been able to,
Quantify.
I haven't, yeah, you can't quantify it. There's some amps you just play and you like them. You just automatically like them. You identify with these amps, and then you try to reproduce that. But most of the, you know, we're wizards, but I'm not a wizard. I'm a fucking mechanic. You know, I do electronic mechanics. I'm like a guy who, you know, we're working on race cars, and we're tweaking these race cars, but it's no magic. It's just hard work. You have to, I mean, how long, Dave, did you take before you came up with you had an example, but, and you used it and you've run with that. Years. It takes years, and then when you accidentally find this thing, that's, because every amp, you know, Miles has this thing, oh, that amp's 50 watts of whatever. You know, it's an amp, it makes sound, but there's, sometimes you're lucky enough to stumble onto something that just has got magic, and that's the only word I can.
Or 50 watts of who cares.
50 watts of whatever, yeah. So,
You know what's kind of interesting, Mike, though, is that there's like 900 and something guys building amplifiers now. And they're all making potato soup of one sort or another. And it's you guys that are playing through them where the magic comes from. And it's that emotional response, whether it's my amp or Dave's amps or Todd's amps or what Mike's worked on. Like Mike says, he can build whatever he wants for whatever situation. And he's looking for that thing in his ear that makes it the least amount of work to play through. So you're going to go through all the rooms here and stuff, and you might find an amplifier that you just go, man, I hate it. And the next guy that walks through the door goes, oh my God, I've been looking for this my whole life. Okay, and that's kind of where I'm hearing this with the panel. That was me. I didn't need to build another amplifier. I had really great amps out in my shed, and I sold some really great amplifiers to start my amp business. And now I don't have those great amps, and I don't have any money, and I don't have anything left, but I'm building my amplifiers because somebody has that same emotional response when they play it. They're like, oh my gosh, I can go write music with this. And that's why I do it. It truly is to hear that response of someone going, wow, I'm motivated. And I don't have to work at my tone. From this point on, I get to work at my music. I'm going to go home, I'm going to put my guitar, and I'm going to put my magic to this amplifier. And it's whether it's mine or, I mean, there's some really great amps out there, and they're built a lot better than they used to be. You know, I get a lot of these hand-wired ones that come through the shop, and I mean, I've had Barths that were built by the guy that worked for Rickenbacker. Really neat tone, really dug working on that amp. Very simple, hand-wired, it was a mess inside. The guy that owns that now just absolutely loves that amp. Will take that amp over any other amplifier. So what is it that stirs that emotion in you is what you're kind of looking for, is the one that you can go play, and it might be a Line 6 pod.
It's a combination, too, of the player. It's the chemistry. It's the chemistry of the player and the equipment. I mean, for example, I can grab one of Mike's like Fender Blackface Supers and his 64 Strat, and if I played that, people would leave the room. You know, I mean, it would just really sound terrible. And I know other people like Carl Verheyen, he could play through a, you know, one of those Vox battery-powered $35 whatever with a Squier Strat, and people would be going like, oh my God, that's amazing. You know, it's chemistry. It's an amp that you feel good about and a guitar that you feel good about, and it brings out the best in you.
hey, this amp works good with pedals, or this amp doesn't work so well with pedals? What affects that makes this?
There's a number of things that affect how an amp reacts to pedals. One issue is gain. Basically, one issue is the pedal, how high the pedal is turned up, the output level of the pedal, hitting the front end of an amp where it compresses and squashes real early. Groove Tubes built an amp called the Solo 45 that was specifically developed for pedal use, where they had a feedback loop that actually kept the V1 to the first gain stage from being overdriven. You have certain amps that use EF86 pentodes in the front end, and usually, depending on how the pentode is implemented, it might be capable of being driven much harder before it compresses or squashes. There's a number of factors. I'd actually like Mike to pick up on this, because Mike was the designer at 65 amps when EF86s were used, EF86s were not used, various things came into play. He did one amp that is now called the Ventura, but the code name on it was Mr. Belvedere. And the reason it was called Mr. Belvedere is because Mike found a old photograph or something from an old magazine of Mr. Belvedere, and he stuck it on the power transformer and kind of dubbed the name, and it kind of went up from
What the hell are you talking about?
Yeah, no, and where did that come from?
I do not recall.
Where did the picture of Mr. Belvedere
Okay, Mr. Belvedere was a butler.
Right.
And basically, this little amp, it was a gentlemanly amp. The EF86 has a gigantic dynamic range, and if you don't push it too hard.
Wait, but there was a picture of Mr.
Yes,
Belvedere.
there was.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that was the whole point.
But you're talking about pedals. It depends on how much gain you put at the very front of the amp. That's the most important tube for the sound of the amp. Everything else after that has less and less to do with the basic sound. So some people gain the hell out of the first stage. If you want to have pedals, you have to basically on the Ventura, I low gained that tube purposely. So it had dynamic range, but it's a pentode, so it sounds like a power tube. So you can drive the snot out of it, it's not going to crush, and I added gain later. They have a tendency to be microphonic, and a lot of, like the old AC-15s, AC-30s, they came out, they originally had an EF86, sounded amazing, but they were just microphonic as hell. Too much gain in that tube. So I just put gain later on, add tubes later on, and kind of build it up slowly. And then you have the EF86 sound, the big dynamic range, can take a lot of crushing pedals, distortions and things, and it won't squash because it'll compress. A lot of amps, some amps you'll just, Fenders are great at that. They don't compress, you can use a lot of pedals. Some amps, though, that are already high gain, you put a pedal in front of them and you get nothing. It's like, push the pedal and you get no extra sound because it's just compressed already. It's already squashed. So it's just the design thing. So Dave, take it away, Dave.
I think it depends on what you want to do with your pedals. Coming from a rig designer standpoint, if you want the pedal to boost your volume and to if you're going to primarily get your overdrive out of your pedal, let's say, you do want a much cleaner amp that's not, pushing the tube at the beginning. So basically what happens is you hit an amp that's already compressing with a pedal and it doesn't go anywhere. It'll give you more gain, but it's not going to get louder. It's not, you can shape the tone with it. But it depends on what you want to do. There's some people that will have an overdriven amp, like say one of my amps or something, or a Marshall-esque amp or something like that, that's already overdriven, and they just want to hit it a little harder with a pedal, or add a pedal for color. They add a tube screamer because it just a little more boost with a little more mid-range, and that's great for leads for them. Sometimes they like the pedal on with a really high gain amp because they like what it does. It tightens it up in a certain way, or or something like that. So it really depends on what you want to do with your pedals, what kind of pedals you're using. So there's no amp necessarily that takes pedals poorly. They just take them differently, and depends on what you want to do with your system.
Dave, you build these these gigantic pedal boards for people. Do they typically go into the front end, or they use the loop when they use your?
A mixture of both, depending on the player. You know, like if it's more of a classic kind of player using cleaner amps, they put everything in the front. If it's a guy that's playing more gain, they'll probably use the loop and the front of the amp. So some of the delays and processing like that is in the loop of the amp, and then the stuff's up front. It depends. Both.
Yeah, I'd like to chime in and just say that I agree that it's really a design question. So, you know, any designer, any amplifier, like, you know, let's use an analogy and say, I'm going to build a Corvette here. This thing's going to be really kind of a Corvette. So it's not going to be, you know, a Cadillac, right? So, like, you know, like was said, there's a gain structure that's designed in, and there's also the power amp too, I think, which is often overlooked factor when you talk about that kind of stuff. So in smaller amps, you know, if you have, you know, let's say it's a 10-watt amp or a 15-watt amp, that output stage really kind of crunches in its own way. That's part of the character of that amp. It actually gets kind of, you know, harmonic and distorted, especially if you're using a smaller core output transformer. That's kind of part of your thing. So an amp, you know, like that, let's call that a, you know, I don't know, let's call that a Corvette, right? It maybe isn't going to take gainy pedals real well because it's sort of already squashed by itself. All you got to do is turn it up. And if you use an amplifier that's got a little more headroom, I think, especially at that output stage, and maybe a bigger hunk of iron before you get to the speakers, at least that's been my finding, that a lot of times those amps are more pedal friendly if you're really looking to do a lot with pedals. It's a good question, because I think these days, you know, a lot of it, at least especially in my town in Nashville, right? A lot of guys now are all about pedals and amps with a lot of headroom. And it's kind of funny, because it's kind of like that. When did that shift happen, you know? Anyhow, it's a great question. I think it's just about design. That's why we design different kind of stuff and different kind of sounds.
Yeah, Dave, by the way, has Nashville Amp Service, and as a manufacturer, he's the go-to guy. I've called him over and over again. We got artists on the road that broke down in Nashville. He knows them all. Speed dial, Keith Urban, no problem.
It's Todd, by the way, and that's it. This is bullshit.
What did I call you? What did I call him? Dave?
Yeah.
Okay. Dave's the guy in L.A. then. That's what I meant. But no, Todd is always a very gracious guy and knows he's the guy to go in Nashville. He knows, and that's where, by the way, that's where they still use electric guitars and amplifiers to make records, you know, instead of computers, which is L.A. So that's, I think he's in a beautiful place to, he knows everybody, and he's building his own amps. I think he's got in a good position to do well with his amp company, because he knows everybody.
Thank you, brother.
You know where a lot of the good LA players end up going is to Nashville.
But they're using guitars. Every record has a guitar on it and an amplifier. You know, that's L.A. It's, you know, who knows what the hell.
Hi, I'm Gary Heidkamp from Heidkamp Technology. I'd just like to make a comment on amplifiers and what people typically want. They're more acclimated. Everybody wants a lighter amp, first of all. Too heavy is not a good thing. Second thing they want is good tone, good dynamics. And they tend to look at amplifiers in a different point. Low power is a big issue now. They want low power, and they want 6L6s typically are what they want. And they tend to be older folks, and they tend to want to go for EL 34s, and that's pretty much it. But I can tell you that weight is a big deal, and most of the older folks that tend to be in their 60s to perform, their big complaint is it's too damn heavy. They want minimum controls. A tone control and a volume control is more than what they adequately want. And that's pretty much it as far as the amplification.
Well, there's a big push in other companies, and we're getting in on where they're going to Class D amplifiers for the output sections. You're going to get an amplifier, a 600-watt amp that weighs 2 pounds. You know, the bass amps, Mark Bass, they're already doing this, and they're very susceptible to blowing up if you wire them wrong. But if you can get around that, that's a big thing. Like you said, I have beautiful, great amps. I do a lot of gigs, and I just leave them at home because I don't want to move them. I don't have somebody moving them for me. And if I did, then I'd bring all my artillery. But for me, I bring the smallest little thing that'll do the job, and it's in your hands. You know, it's in your hands. I can, like you said, Eddie Van Halen plays any amp in here, it'll still sound like him. Everybody's all, I want to get that brown sound. Eddie can't get that brown sound anymore, right? Listen to the records. He does it. So it was just a time in microphones, and it was all different. You can't catch that. You can't catch that in a bottle. So stop trying. Stop trying. But
The other thing that they're looking for is saying.
well, you say they. I mean, we are actually dealing with these people. We're buying and selling. So I don't know. I don't particularly agree with everything you said, because I have people who want the opposite of what you said. You may have customers that want that, and I'm one of them. You know, I want a light amp. I want an amp that sounds good, but you know, it's not necessary. I for instance, Dave took off with this 100-watt high gain amp, and I thought, how's that ever going to sell? But he sold the shit out of these things. I stand corrected. I thought, who's going to want a high gain Marshall in 2005? And I've been proven wrong. So, testify. So who knows? Nobody knows what everybody wants. Like you said, you think everybody wants something. I don't agree with that. Everybody.
The other comment I have, you talked about biasing. Fenders, aqua tubes tend to last longer, primarily because they're biasing cold. And they tend to not push them as hard.
Well, that varies depending on, Mesa Boogie bias is cold, but the thing is, a Fender amp, even if it's biased hotter, up at around 60 or 70%, the tubes will still last longer than a cathode biased amp that's running at 110 to 140%.
That's true.
That's just physics.
And a lot of tone,
That's subjective. Tone is subjective.
it tends to be, forgot what I was going to say.
That's okay, because it's subjective. It's your opinion.
The aqua transformer, which you didn't mention too much about, has a lot to do with the tone.
Has a huge amount to do with tone. That's why I'm a huge fan of mercury magnetics.
So do I. I'm a California.
Yeah, no, they're great. But yeah, all of these things have a factor. They're all subjective. The iron in an amplifier is the heart and soul of an amp. It's the most expensive component in an amplifier.
I think something that I find in amplifiers, again, it's a design thing, especially if you start with good iron, right? Because there's differences. And so everything you do in that circuit changes everything in the whole amp. I find if like we can get into talking about carbon comp resistors versus carbon film or metal film, or polypropylene coupling caps versus mylar or polyester. They all have a thing. They all have a sound, and you know, if you put polypropylene caps throughout the whole amplifier, which a lot of people do, and some people, you know, like that, that's a real tight, fast, kind of loud sound, I find. But if you change a couple of them in one stage, you change the sound of the amplifier, and it's not, you're not changing a value really. You're just changing a type of a dielectric material in there, and depending on what kind of transformer you got at the output and what kind of speakers you're listening through, it sort of starts to change the character of the amp. So, but you know, although I think you made some great points that there is definitely a trend toward, well, you know, rock and rollers getting older, and they don't want to lift heavy shit around or have, you know, 100-watt amps. You're right, but there's also a wide range of people that play all kinds of different music, and, you know, everybody wants something different. I think what most real guitar players want is they just want to get on stage and plug in, or in a studio and plug in and go, ah, that's it, that's the shit, that's what I need. And if you can give somebody that, I think they might get over the fact that it's a couple of pounds too heavy, you know, because that's what people want, right? That's what they want. I saw Jeff, when I played with Rod Stewart, we did a couple of shows with Jeff Beck about 15 years ago. And it blew my mind because, you know, I got to stand on the side of the stage next to his guy about 10 feet away from him and watch him play. And I noticed he had a green Stratocaster. He had a 410 Bassman reissue, I think. And he had a pretty good-looking 50-watt Marshall head with a 412 box and a rat pedal sitting on top of the amp. That's it. He didn't have any buttons. He didn't have any switches. He had a volume control on his guitar. He was playing through a rat the whole time. And it sounded amazing. And, you know, so, you know, point being, like, if you're Jeff Beck, I think you play through whatever you want to play through. You know, you tell the guys what you want, and they put it in the truck. And maybe not everybody's like that, but every player's going to find his sound. I don't know, you know. Personally, I'm like into just like, I just want to have the best stuff there is. I'll think about how big it is and what it weighs later, because I think the first thing is getting that sound matched up. Yeah.
Transformers. Output transformer, power transformer.
Yeah, and the material to make the transformer, the laminations is very important. The type of, it has to have a certain amount of silicone in it, and they sound different. You can put, and we've done it, you know, what is it, P6, or what is the
M6.
M6, M12, what the iron, it sounds different. And you have to specify that when you call out a production.
That gets into all kinds of things.
Manufacturing.
You have what's called hysteresis. It's the response curve when a magnetic field is collapsing. Yeah, it just gets into a whole bunch of complicated stuff. But kind of the way you could look at it this way, if you take an amp like a Fender Hot Rod Deluxe amp, the iron, the transformer set in that amplifier probably costs about $9 or $10. A Mercury replacement set might cost $180. The difference is, in that amp, it's kind of like you were in a shower. I'm going to use an old LSD analogy from the 60s. It's like when you have a shower door that's a frosted shower door, you're going through your whole life looking through glasses made of that, and when you take LSD, the door is gone. Now it's the same thing with good iron in an amplifier. It's more articulate, the sustain is better. When somebody hits a G chord, like a bar chord, you can hear each individual string instead of it coming together in a chord. There's just more articulation and definition. Somebody has removed the shower door.
It's insane.
It works on music.
Yeah, don't touch it, Todd.
No,
Stay clear.
but it's true. Better iron, better transformers. It's the heart and soul. It's the motor. People think, does the output transformer? I completely, I think the power transformer is way underlooked about having bass response and things. It's just as important. People think, I'm going to change this output transformer, it's going to make they two work together. You know, it's a transmission and a motor, and they both need to work together. And we were talking about, I think Todd was talking about the saturating we have an amp, we had an amp at 65 called the Elvis. This is one of our best-selling amps. It sells still. And we took a transformer that was for a much more powerful amp, and we got this little tiny 10-watt Vox-type transformer, and it crushes this transformer. It's so much, it's got so much current, it just smashes the transformer. The laminations want to fly apart. We had to build it a certain way so that laminations wouldn't come to pieces. But what it does is amazing. You know, it's just amazing. So, and there's, you do the opposite. You can do the opposite, you know, by doing the laminations on the power transformer, less, you have more mid-range, more high-end, more power, and not so much bass response. So people overlook the power transformer a lot.
And the whole grain structure.
I think the power transformer is the motor.
Yeah.
And the transmission is how it uses that available current, available dynamic range, frequency response. Is how it translates it into, you know, turning the wheels.
And the interleaving on a transformer, the plates, rather than just be like this, when you get into interleaving, you can have like the plates turned like this, the grain structure, or you can have it turned one plate like this, the next plate like this, the next plate when you look at those laminations. Get somebody to pull the back off of some amplifier when you're at some of these places, and you can look. I don't know if we have any is Mercury here? I don't know if Mercury's here.
They're not displaying, they're walking around.
Okay, but I mean, that's what you look at. Some transformers, you look at the laminations, and you can actually see some of the interleaving characteristics. And that's expensive. And hand-wound transformers are more expensive than machine-wound transformers. M6 steel is 30 or 40 times more expensive than other types of steel. M6 has no silicone in it. The reason you put silicone in steel is so you can start boiling this stuff and walk away. When steel boils, it ruins it. But if you put a lot of silicone in it, its boiling point is so high that people at foundries can walk away from this stuff and not care. But M6 doesn't have silicone in it, so it has to be kept at a different temperature, and it's much more labor intensive to make. All of these things come into play, and Mike, you can tell me to shut up now.
No, I was just going to talk about a shower and the way the glass looks. No, but unfortunately, and I can only speak for myself, but transformers is kind of a mystery thing for me. I don't know about the rest of you guys. It's something I don't know enough about. I would like to know more. There's a few people that know a lot. Sergio at Mercury, I wish I knew more about how those things work. I just have to take for granted that he knows what he's doing. When I ask him, I want this, I want frequency response, I want to have full bandwidth down to 30 cycles, that kind of stuff, and he goes, okay. And I just have to trust him. But there's a lot of people making transformers, really good magnetic components out of Chicago who used to do all the Supro. They were originally Supro people, and they are very good, you know. And there's Chinese transformers that sound good, but it's a mystery to me, and I have to admit it. I know the rest of the crap. I know how to do that. You know, if you got an amp, you want it to sound away. I know how to do that. But as far as designing transformers, it's something I wish I knew more about, because my bandwidth is not that wide.
I'm gonna wrap this up actually at this point because it's noon. These guys have their rooms. If you want to talk to any of them more in depth, you can track them down and get into a one-on-one with them and learn more about their personal views and philosophy. So that's about it.
Todd wanted to say something.
Todd, go for it.
I was just going to kind of cap
Dave,
that one a little bit, that, you know, there is a thing that maybe we touched on here that's part of this discussion that doesn't need to get quite to whether they're M6 steel and how they're interleaved and silicone and maybe a little LSD sprinkled in there too. But there is a relationship, right, between the power supply and the output of a guitar amplifier that we pay particular attention to, or even if we don't know it, right? So that part of a power transformer that is going to wear that current rating, especially of that B+ coil, is going to start to sag. It's going to say, we're at the maximum power supply now for your output stage. We really got no more. So it's a form of compression. Rectifier tubes are the same sort of form, right? Certain rec tubes have different, it's almost like plugging in different limiters in a studio and going, this one does this one does that, right? So a power transformer is part of a design in relationship with your output stage, right? Where are my plates of my output tubes going to start clipping my signal? In relationship with that power transformer, where's it going to stop providing more power? And that's where a lot of magic between, you know, when I hold out a G chord, the thing goes, kind of hangs for a second in a certain way, that there's a lot of mojo in there, you know, without getting into, is it a steel or is it a this or is it Japanese or who makes it? But just where do those ratios and how do they interact with each other?
Where that stuff becomes really important is if you're on LSD.
Yes.
Then you need to know that. Or
This is
think you do.
this is something you can see for yourself. This is where the power transformer runs out of energy. On an old Fender black face or a silver face, just play the notes, da 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 da, boo 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 boo. When the low notes on the E string start going, boo 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 boo, that's the power transformer running out of juice. That's something you can demonstrate. And if you had if you bought a better power transformer that had energy to play those notes, and that's when we build amps, we do. We try to avoid what Fender did, even though Fender is the most pop. But just try it. Da 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 da. It's the power transformer run out of juice. Leo was cheap. He didn't have mercury magnetic transformers.
Oh, okay, yeah. Some of us have to be here for a photo.
Thanks, guys. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.